Hi everyone, Professor King here. In this video, I'm going to be talking about Gayatri Spivak's Can the Subaltern Speak, which is an excerpt from a larger text called A Critique of Postcolonial Reason. A lot of words there, but we'll get through them, I promise. As always, at the beginning of my videos, I like to remind you to pause where you need to pause. Some of these ideas can be a little heady and challenging, and so if you need to take a break or stop the video to take down notes and then restart, that's what it's here for. And also, if there are things that even after, this sort of video explanation, they're still just really murky and hard to unpack, I encourage you to message me through, whichever medium of your choosing that fits best for you. I'm always here to help, so keep that in mind. But without further ado, we'll take it to the share screen and we will talk Spivak. Gayatri Chakravorty Spivak. How exciting. All right, so again, this is a section entitled Can the Subaltern Speak? From Spivak's A Critique of Postcolonial Reason. This is a seminal text of postcolonial theory. So if this is something that interests you and that you want to learn more about, I would say, Spivak, she's still alive too. She's done a lot of great stuff since the publication of this chapter, but of this whole book. But if this is something that you want to explore in more depth, you definitely want to start with people like Spivak and with Said. I know we don't cover Homi Bhabha in this class, but Bhabha is another really killer one. So let's proceed. I know in the last module I posted Christopher Flynn's video, but if you haven't had and I love the pause on this poor guy. If you want to review that, it's in last week's module. It's in a previous module. So just check out that video entitled Postcolonial Theory by Dr. Christopher Flynn out of the University of Texas at Austin. Very helpful in just kind of setting down the basics, the fundamentals of what postcolonial theory is. All right, so let's move on. The more challenging the text we have, the more I like to share some of these theoretical definitions so that we can be sure we're on the same page. And when you go back and reread and highlight and check your notes and all that, you can go, oh, that's what this person's talking about, right? So the first definition is essentialism. We've talked about this before, but let's talk about it now in terms of Spivak. So for Spivak, we're talking about groups. And so definition of essentialism we'll use here is similar to those we've used in the past, but again, we just sort of zhuzh them to make sure that they fit the particular field of theory we're talking about. And essentialism is the notion that since essence is prior to existence, different groups of people, I think I was going to say, different groups possess different qualities that define them as separate and distinct from one another. So before we talked about essentialism in terms of concepts or in terms of individuals, now because we're looking at Spivak and Spivak is looking at colonized groups, right, entire nations, we're talking about how groups are considered to possess different qualities that define them as separate and distinct. Now this can be positive, negative, or neutral, right? Like we can say Americans have more gun deaths per capita than any other nation in the Western world. That's that's an essentialist quality in and of the fact that prior to any of us being born, there was the Second Amendment, which has been misconstrued, right, to mean that anyone can shoot anyone with a gun, right? If you look at the Second Amendment, it's actually that we're supposed to arm ourselves against tyranny, not sort of the person who cut us off in traffic. But that's neither here nor there for this discussion, right? But the essentialist, understanding of that would be, America gun culture, right? An essentialist term that could be like a stereotype would be like, oh, women are emotional, right? And if you watch the Sedgwick video already, I kind of, in my YouTube notes and in the video, I kind of talk about how that's a mess. But, you know, it assumes, like, right, just how Freud assumed that women were hysterical because of their uteruses. It assumed that our essence as women was prior to our existence, right? Like that it was innate as opposed to shaped by external factors, in other words, and that it was unchanging. You know, so that would be a negative stereotype of essentialism, right? And then the next term we have is positivism, and this is not like up the people, right? Like that doesn't, this term positivism doesn't have anything to do with like positivity, right? Good vibes only. It's none of that. What positivism in this sense, in the theoretical sense, is the idea that every reasonable claim can be empirically verified or is capable of logical proof, right? There has to, if this exists, right, it can be proven, right? If I'm saying this exists, I have to show that it can be logically proven, okay? And Spivak provides some critique of that, right? And this last term is incredibly important to Spivak. So it's incredibly important that we as readers know it. And this is the term epistemic violence, which is derived from Foucault. Again, when we think about theory, they're all responding to one another. They're all kind of finding the lack in other people's arguments, but they're building on their prior knowledge, prior theoretical knowledge, right? And so Spivak takes this notion of epistemic violence from Foucault and applies it to this notion of subalternity, right? And for Spivak, epistemic violence means the forcible replacement of one structure of beliefs, discourse, or breadth of knowledge for another. Because if you remember Sedgwick, if you watch the video on Sedgwick, Sedgwick talks about the epistemology of the closet. And if you haven't yet, you'll see this. Epistemology is a study of knowledge, right? So we're talking about epistemology, we're talking about knowledge, right? And knowledge construction. With Spivak, this right here, we're talking about who controls knowledge and who disseminates knowledge and who usurps the knowledge of a group that came before is really what we're talking about. So I put this little image here to sort of illustrate this notion of epistemic violence, right? Because if we're talking in terms of colonized nations, right? Geographic locations that have been colonized by Western, you know, empirical forces. We have to think about how those existing structures of knowledge were violently overturned, right, in favor of a Western way of thinking, okay? So like if you look at this image right here, right, it's this sort of like benevolent, you know, English or European pilgrim, you know, where the woman cooked all the food. It's all, you know, the woman clearly did all the domestic labor, right? And she's so kindly sharing her food with the sort of exotic looking natives, right? And everything is beautiful and peaceful. There's people making food in the background. There's children and a dog, right? This image itself is a form of epistemic violence because it's not physical violence, right? Like that clearly happened outside, you know, that clearly is what probably really happened, right? But if we think about the construction of knowledge and the idea that the West somehow came to civilize, right, these colonized countries, and that the West's way of doing things and viewing things was the superior way, that is epistemic violence, right? To come into a culture that already exists and to say, you know what, I'm just going to steamroll my belief system over you at large, right? It's not just like one person doing it, it's a whole culture doing it, right? You know, and make it so that your knowledge methodologies are rendered obsolete or other or undesirable, right? What Spivak is saying is there's a violence in that, right? It may not be like I shot you or I punched you in the face, but it's violent in the sense of like, I am taking over. And the way that knowledge is going to be constructed for everybody from here on out is based on what I say, right? That's where the violence, the epistemic, the violence of knowledge comes in, right? And a lot of times it is sort of hand in hand with real violence, right? Like if we think about, you know, the 24 million Native Americans that have died as a result of the genocide enacted upon them, right, by Western forces. If we think about like how horrifically violent Western colonization of the indigenous land that we're all now standing and existing on, how that happened, right? That happened in conjunction with this epistemic violence, right? This violence of knowledge. So they're separate things, but a lot of times they happen together, right? So keep that in mind. So with what voice consciousness then can the subaltern speak, right? This is what Spivak is looking at. And just to give you a little background, Gayatri Chakraborty Spivak is from India, right? She's from the Indian subcontinent. So she's taught in America for probably close to 50 years. Started at university, you know, she was at University of Iowa, Columbia. She's had a visiting fellowship at UC Santa Barbara. She is a really heavy hitter in this world. And she's like Saeed, she's influenced by Gramsci. And this idea of the subaltern is taken from Gramsci. But where Gramsci is talking about the given members of a Western society who lack access to power, Spivak is looking at them in colonized societies, okay? So as the textbook states, and this is from the second edition, the page numbers, words are the same in the third edition, I just don't have the page numbers for those. Subalterns are those outside of the hierarchy of power, okay? People who are socially, politically, economically, geographically, in terms of gender, sexuality, country of origin, space of origin, religion, etc., different or as far different as possible from the elite. So think about like, you know, Jeff Bezos is now a trillionaire, like, yay, right? We're all still struggling with our $1,200 stimulus checks. Think about the person, so he's got a lot of power, he's got a lot of voice, he's got a lot of cachet in this world because we live in a capitalist society, right? Think about the person who is at the opposite end of where Jeff Bezos is, and that would be a subaltern, right? If he sort of represents the top of the hierarchy of power, think of the person who is in every single way the opposite of him. Especially in a colonized society, right? And America's a colonized society, but Spivak again is focusing on India because that's where she comes from. So to Spivak, the subaltern must be considered not just from the lens of postcolonial theory, but also from the lens of feminist theory as it intersects with postcolonialism, right? Because again, when we're talking about power relationships, power and identity, they don't exist in vacuums, right? People who have certain aspects of power, be that based on how they are racialized, based on how they are gendered, based on their sexual orientation, their class status, right? All of that affects the amount of power that a given individual with these complex multiple identity markers has in a given society, okay? So Spivak is concerned with gender and postcolonialism as they exist, right? And she provides this story about Baduri Bhattacharya, right, where she illustrates this, and we'll talk about that in a moment. So if we have epistemic violence, right, then how do we counteract that? Well, one way we do, according to Spivak, is through these things called speech acts. And so in the same way that epistemic violence is a violence of knowledge, right, a speech act is not necessarily always words, but it is an act, right, that serves as speech to affirm one's identity, right? I don't know if like you're familiar with the image of the man standing in front of a tank at Tiananmen Square, right? That's a speech act. That's him saying this, you know, this violent fascism will no longer, is no longer okay with me, right? And I'm going to stand against this. You know, you see all this stuff about people saying, go vote, go vote, go vote in November 2020. You know, voting can be seen as a speech act because you're saying, you know, I either am totally happy with the way things are, which I doubt that's very many of us, could be wrong. Or you can vote and say, you know, my vote wants to go this way, right? So they're actions that, and usually politically motivated actions that serve to affirm one's identity as a citizen, right? So I want to go back to this notion of subalterns for a second, right? In Spivak's country of origin in India, right, we have this caste system. And Spivak kind of looks at the caste system from a different way, right? She sees kind of the 4 categories that go into the caste system based on Western colonizing influence. So if we think about subalterns, like the people who are the furthest away from power, that might be people like the untouchables. I don't know if you've ever heard of like the untouchables in India. But in each colonized culture, right, it might look a little bit different. But again, they are the people who are furthest away from what is considered power, possession in our society, right, in a given society. So I have some questions about Spivak here to make you think about as you're reading, because Spivak's pretty easy. I'm not going to give all of her away the way I kind of did with Sedgwick. I want you to think about what she has to say, right? First of all, what roles do imperial roles? There we go. What roles do imperialism and colonization play in affecting subalterns? So in other words, like, if there's something having to do with power and subalterns are the furthest from that power, where do imperialism and colonization, Western imperialism and colonization, come into play in that sort of hierarchy of power? When Spivak talks about Bhavanaswari Baduri's suicide, why is she telling us this story? Why is she telling us this story about a woman who has to commit the speech act of suicide, right? At a very specific time. I'm not going to give more away than that. Why? Why would Bhavanaswari Baduri have to do that, right? Given what we know about her status as a woman, given what we know about her involvement in politics, given what we know about what's kind of going on in India at the time, according to what Spivak says, right? What do you make of that story as it pertains to subalternity, as it pertains to speech acts? And what do you think she means, Spivak? What do you think Spivak means when she writes, I think it's important to acknowledge our complicity in the muting of the subaltern. So in other words, again, can the subaltern speak? Well, if the subaltern is muted, we're complicit in that. Our work cannot succeed if we always have a scapegoat. Think about that. And then she has these 3 points that she shares. And what's she getting at with those points, right? Think about that. And now let's think about this in terms of M. Butterfly, right? Especially because we're talking in M. Butterfly about gender, we're talking about colonization, imperialism, right? So how is song capable of speaking, performing a speech act, right? And in what ways can't she speak? And then think about the role that each of the play and where you see it happening specifically within this play. Think about the role that imperialism and colonialism play, empire and colonization, right? Gender, politics, sex, sexuality, and reproduction. And the last one is performance, right? There's this very thoughtful understanding of what it means to perform, right? To act, to be somebody else, to pretend for an audience, to create, right? If we're talking about an artist. So I want you to think about that, not only in relation to the play, but in relation to all of these other items that are mentioned. But there's more. I know I had you read an article, Wadler's The True Story, right, of M. Butterfly. And in the play itself, there's this mention of the Vietnam War, even though this play takes place in China. So if we think about that, what does song ultimately do? What does Guillemard ultimately do? What does Spivak write about? How does this relate to the Vietnam War and what we know historically about the Vietnam War in terms of a speech act and in terms of epistemic violence? In her essay, Spivak notes how it's Baduri who commits the speech act of suicide, right? I want you to think about that. Why, how Baduri does it, why she does it, when she does it, what it means, what it says, etc. Then compare that to the suicide that happens in M. Butterfly. What's similar? What's different? First of all, who is committing suicide? I'm sorry, that's who is dying by suicide in M. Butterfly? Who's dying by suicide in M. Butterfly? What's similar? What's different? What does this show the audience? How are we supposed to take this speech act of suicide versus Baduri's, if we can compare the two? And then think about Sedgwick. Do songs or Renee's genders matter? Does anything change as we sort of see this play with gender and this revelation to one another about gender roles, gender assumptions, as things are revealed between them and to the audience? Okay, so there's a lot to consider here in terms of the play. So keep that in mind. Check out Sedgwick if you haven't already done so. And yeah, that's about it. I hope this was helpful. Again, if questions arise, as always, message me. But I can't wait to read your responses to this play. All right. Hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day, and I will see you in cyberspace. Bye.